Welcome to Permission to Shift, the show that helps you remove limits, transform fear, and get into a life you're excited to live. Today's guest is Bryan Collins. At a young age, Bryan decided he wanted to become a writer and did all the things he was supposed to do. He went to school, then college, and later got a job as a journalist. There was just one problem. He wasn't a very good journalist. After losing his job and drifting in and out of other jobs, even plucking chickens, he discovered today's writers spend time building relationships online and self-publishing. So he founded Become a Writer Today and spent years carefully observing the processes of successful writers. Today, he has written several best-selling books, including The Power of Creativity and Become a Writer Today series for writers. He's also contributed to publications like Forbes, Lifehacker, and Fast Company. Bryan now works with new writers and shares what he's discovered in the form of practical advice so they can write a book, get published, and make money writing. Welcome to the show, Bryan. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Anna, it's very nice to talk to you and your audience. Thanks for having me on.
Amazing, amazing. So I'm going to jump right in because we have a whole lot of goodness here to cover today. And one of the first things I know that my audience is going to want to know from you is a little bit about how you got where you are. What are the shifts that you had to make?
Sure. So I am an author from Ireland, and I was originally a journalist. Back in 2000, I figured the best way to become a writer was to learn how to be a professional journalist. And unfortunately, I didn't spend much time going to college. I spent more time going out and getting drunk and just having a good time. So when I graduated college, I thought that I would land straight into a well-paying job. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and I actually spent a couple of years drifting in and out of work and at a low-paying freelance writing gigs. So I almost gave up on writing, and I went into another career in social care, but I still wanted to do something a bit creative. So I started writing fiction on the side, and I took a series of writing classes in the Irish Writers' Centre in Dublin. So I spent a couple of years writing short stories. I entered a few competitions, placed in them, didn't win any. And by the time I got to my late 20s, it was like, I've been at this for 10 years, never made a full-time living out of writing apart from 1 or 2 good months. Sure, the recession didn't help, but maybe I should just, focus on a different career. At the time, I was also reading a lot of technology and productivity blogs. And I said, no, you know what? I'm going to just try something else. I'm going to start the Irish version of Lifehacker, which your audience may know was like one of the biggest productivity sites on the internet. Huge back in the 2011, 2012. It's still pretty big. I quickly found out it's impossible for one lone washed out journalist to compete with a big media organization like Lifehacker. So that didn't work out. But what happened is I enjoyed blogging and I enjoyed getting emails from readers. So I said, well, what's the one thing I do know something about? And that was writing. So I created a new site called Become a Writer Today, where I created articles about the writing process and how other creative people write their books and tell their stories. And to my surprise, I started getting comments from readers and people started sharing my work. And that led me into a couple of different career paths related to writing, such as copywriting, self-publishing books, and creating online courses. So that's my journey as a writer to date so far.
What I really love about what you just said is, as you were going through all of these different shifts, you saw each one as a step into the next thing. And you didn't simply just write off your writing. You kept pivoting your writing.
It certainly didn't feel like a journey at the time. It felt like frantically scrambling from one paycheck to the next. But I always wanted to do something that involved the written word and creative work. So even when I was working in other jobs, like I worked out for a charity for a while, pretty frustrating experience. Not a criticism of the charity, but just that the job wasn't cut out for me. And one of the ways I kind of dealt with that stress was through journaling. So yeah, I've always been writing on the side, whether it's fiction or journaling or non-fiction these days. So it's kind of been a means of expression. It's cheaper than therapy. And then it kind of turned into an online business.
As I drool, that was very elegant. And I know you wrote, and it's a series of 3 books, right? About the process that you've come to through all of this experience. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I started my site, I discovered the world of self-publishing, and I started writing books that I was going to publish on Amazon. And the first book I wrote was a book about how creative people and authors can use Twitter. And I got as far as writing the first draft and mocking up the cover. And then I said, well, actually, I don't want to write an instruction manual about Twitter. So, so I decided to publish a book of short stories. Didn't sell any copies, but I was like mesmerized by how easy it was to self-publish. So then I wrote a book about productivity for freelancers, which sold some copies, but there's a few issues with the book, which I fixed later on. And then I wrote a 3-part series about creativity, where I wrote about how other creative people alive and from the past approach their art. And I've also written a series of writing books. And at the moment, I'm just finalizing a parenting memoir. So I've tried a couple of different genres over the years, but I've kind of gravitated mostly towards nonfiction after that collection of short stories.
Hmm. And I really did appreciate, and specifically, it was interesting to me, and how I think I found you was through that series of 3 books on creativity. And there were a whole bunch of really cool things you talked about. Can we go through some of them here? Because I have this list of things that I know my viewers would just love to dig into.
Yeah, so I wrote the book, The Power of Creativity, when I was in my early to mid 30s. So I'm 40 this year. So I wrote it a few years ago. So it's always interesting to hear people asking about the book when I wrote it years ago. But that's the funny thing about writing. And to anybody who's listening, if you have a project that you're working on, when you release it out into the world, it's always amazing when someone asks you about it, because you've probably moved on to something else.
Oh,
So
that's so fun.
yeah, no, it's a good reminder that what you do can have a really long tail, and creative work doesn't have to be a success. And this is an idea I touched on in the book. It doesn't have to be a success or sell lots of copies on the first day, the
Hmm.
first week, or even the first month. It can be a year or two down the road when somebody might contact you about a business project they want to partner with you on, or somebody says that they read your book and they send you a nice email about a section that meant something to them, and you're like, I wrote that 4 years ago, I've completely forgotten about it. So that would be my advice for creative work, that when you release it out into the world, it kind of takes on a life of its own. And I guess it's the same when you think of a good album that you enjoy. You have form a relationship with the album and with the musician, and then when you hear them describe their album and what it's about, you might say, that's not what that song was about to me. It was about something else. And that's something I talk about in the book as well, how when you have an idea for something and when you release it out into the world, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to your audience.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Can you explain more about what you mean by when you release something to the world, it doesn't belong to you anymore?
Yes, so I suppose one example would be the idea of your favorite album or your favorite film. But for me, it's always when an artist or a creative person talks about their own work, and the way they describe the ideas in that work are different to how you've interpreted it, how you've read it, or how you've enjoyed it. Um, I suppose, like for me, I mean, I don't write songs. I'm not a songwriter, even though I'd love to be able to write songs. But like for me, it's when you release something out into the world and you have big hopes for it, and then you get zero response, and that can be a little bit disheartening. But then, weeks or months later, you people will contact you about it. Or the other thing that can happen is you release something out into the world and you don't expect much from it. It could be an article, it could be a course, it could be a podcast episode, it could be an interview like this. And then it can surprise you when you look at the stats or the downloads, the views, and it's got a far more than you could have anticipated, even though you didn't maybe spend as much time polishing it as you did on that big piece of work that you thought was going to be a big success. So when you release something out into the world, maybe to let go of expectations about whether you want it to do well, or whether you want it to earn you money, or whether you want it to be a creative success, maybe move on to the next thing. And if it is a success or it does help you land more clients or earn money, fantastic. But if it isn't, don't worry, because you can always take what you learned from that project, from that book, from that podcast, or that online so much, or whatever it is, and move on and use it to get better at your craft.
So, in essence, what you're saying is that creativity is a gift you serve the world with without expectation, in a way?
when you're engaged in the creative process, when you're writing, when you're thinking of a course that you want to create or coming up with an idea for your business, uh, do it without any expectation. Do it for the love of the craft. Do it because it's something you enjoy working on, because it's something that you can kind of sink into, almost, where you cultivate a sense of flow where all sense of time kind of fades away. Um, and there's a time later on for reviewing whether something actually worked or not, when you can kind of put on your business hat or your analytical glasses and review the stats and say to yourself, should I turn my book into a course, or should I turn my course into a speaking gig or a consultancy? So my kind of rough rule that I would work by or write by is, if you work on your craft in the morning and if you work in your business in the afternoon, then you can be satisfied as a creative, and you can be satisfied because you'll be able to pay the bills. So if you spend all day writing poetry, you're probably going to have trouble paying the mortgage, unless you're a really famous poet. But for the rest of us, you probably also need to figure out how you're going to make some money from your poetry too. So find both, find a time for both in the day.
So you touched on two, really, actually more than two, but two big ones here that I'd love to dig into a little bit. And one of them is the idea of flow, how we find flow, how we get into flow, how we're able to have that morning of creativity. A lot of people get hung up on that. They're not sure what task to pursue. What would you recommend for that?
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it, of figuring out what you should work on first. There's so many opportunities, and the problem isn't what to do. It's just picking the right thing to do and sticking with that, because it's easy to chase after the next shiny object. So on a day-to-day level, the night before, ask yourself, what's my number one priority that I have to get done tomorrow? And then you can get up and do that first thing, depending on your family commitments or work commitments. And then when all other things pop up during the day, like phone calls or emails, you'll have already done your most important task. So as an example, when I was working for a corporate company as a copywriter, my most important thing was writing those books that we've talked about there a few minutes ago, Anna. So I'd get up in the morning before work and write for an hour and a half each morning. And then work sometimes would be busy, sometimes it wouldn't be busy, but if it was busy, it wouldn't matter too much, or I wouldn't get too stressed, because I'd already spent 60 to 90 minutes working on the book that I wanted to publish that year. I suppose from a more higher level view, if you zoom out and figure out what you want to accomplish over the next 90 days, I interviewed an author who was nominated for a prestigious prize for her literary fiction a few years ago. And she says she coaches her students to work within 90 days. And oddly enough, this is something I came across in some of the business books I've read too, because a year is too long. When you think about what you want to do, like we're recording this in July, so what you want to do over the next 12 months, July 2022 can feel like a long time away. Mm-hmm. But September is only a few months away. So what you want to get done over the next season or this summer or during the autumn. And that's 90 days is long enough to make some progress on that, but it's not so far away that you're going to procrastinate about it. So pick one important thing to do every day. And that one important thing you focus on should be your big project or your big theme for the next 90 days. And then I would say have one theme for your creative work, and then have one theme that's going to help you build your business or earn an income from creative work. And that's the process that's worked quite well for me. And I think it's a good process for many of the people I've interviewed as well. They seem to have a system for both.
Interesting. So how do you decide, or how do you know what would be something that might be an income generator? Do you simply jump in and try it? Is there a process that you can go through?
Well, I'll come at it from the point of view of writers. I mean, I'm sure your audience have all sorts of creative backgrounds, so it really does depend. But many of the nonfiction authors that I've interviewed, when I started interviewing them for our podcast, I thought that they all earned a living from their books, because I'd go into the local bookstore with my daughter and I'd see them all on the bookshelf, and I'm like, wow, they must be rich from all their books. But turns out you'll only make so much money from a book that sells for $5 or $10, or euro in my case, because I'm in Ireland. And then the publisher takes a cut out of that. So what I found is a lot of the nonfiction authors make a living from everything around their book. So they might have a public speaking gig, and then they would sell copies of their book at the public speaking gig. They might have a course that they would sell. So if you really enjoy the book, you can take one of their courses, which would sell for a lot more. and will give extra information or talk about something that's not in the book. Or they will sell access, so you could work with them directly one-to-one. As an example, I recently read a running book. So I like running. It's a good way for me for dealing with stress. And I read a book about running form, and I Googled the guy online because it was a really good book. I figured out all the things I was doing wrong and what I needed to fix. And then I ended up working with him for a few weeks on a Zoom call for, I think it was $200 or $300. But he gave me like lots of personal coaching advice based on his book, but which was specific to me. And that's how he runs his business. So he has his book, which is a calling card into his courses. And then he also has one-to-one services for, I guess, people who take running a bit too seriously, like I do. For writers, it's often having a business around your book. If you don't have a book, I mean, there's other ways to do it. Do you want to sell online courses? In which case you could use articles to sell your online courses. Or if you're a podcaster or you're recording videos like this, perhaps you have an email list where you're offering some insider content that's not free, or perhaps you're offering sponsorship on your podcast. So kind of comes back to what we're talking about there a few moments ago. The problem isn't finding an opportunity, it's picking the right opportunity and focusing on that until it works.
Let's talk about creative habits, since we're talking about finding the things that work and finding the right business for you. And one of the things you talked about in your books was allowing the inspiration, setting yourself up for success and the things that you do to ensure that you can be creative and you can see the opportunities, and then you can also pick the correct ones.
Yeah, that's I was actually writing an article about that this morning, so it's interesting that you asked me that. So there's a couple of things you can do. You can prepare your work in advance, like we were talking about there a few moments ago, related to your most important task for the day. But for me, it's normally breaking big projects down into small milestones. So to go back to the example of writing a book, that puts a lot of people off because it's 50 or 60,000 words. If it's nonfiction, that's a lot if you haven't written much before. But if you write 300 words every day for 5 days a week, that'll only take you about 15 or 20 minutes. So that's about 2,000 to 3,000 words. If you do that for a month, you'll have about 10 to 15,000 words, maybe more, because chances are you're going to go over 300 words in a couple of days, or you might write at the weekends, depending. And if you do that for 3 months, you'll have 45 to 60,000 words, which is enough for first draft of a book, which is enough to work with an editor, which is enough to turn it into an article, which is enough to get feedback from your readers or from your peers. So whatever the project is, break it down into small milestones. And there's a great piece of advice by the author, Anne Lamott. She describes how when she had to write her book or a school report about birds, she came home and she said it to her dad. And her dad says, just break it down, just write it bird by bird. And I think that's a good advice for anything, whether it's writing or any creative project that you feel is overwhelming.
Take it bird by bird.
Yeah.
Rather
than writing about every bird. Yeah.
Tell me more about getting rid of non-essential activities, because that was another thing. Yes, pick the things that are the right things, but also get rid of the crap that's holding you back.
So creative work sometimes involves making some sacrifices. For me, when I was in my 20s, I spent a lot of time playing video games. Still love video games, but it was very hard to find time for video games because I had 3 kids in between 25 and 34, and also working a job as a copywriter and trying to write a book. So I had to stop playing video games. So that was a kind of a personal example. Other examples might be, so perhaps there's some friendships that worked well when you were in your early 20s, but maybe they were friends of the season or friends of the moment. But people change, and maybe those friendships aren't serving you as much now that you're older, or you're not doing those friendships any justice. Or perhaps it's a job. If you have an opportunity to leave jobs and do something that's a bit more exciting or a bit more closely aligned to whatever your creative values are, you can change jobs. Or in some cases, you could turn down a promotion, or you could turn down a big project at work because it's going to take time away from your creative project, or it's going to cause conflict because you're not going to have time for your creative work, your family life, and your job. So sometimes you have to make sacrifices. So those would be some of the non-essential activities. I guess in the book, I think we were probably thinking of is there was more specific day-to-day stuff that I described, such as leaving your phone in a different room from where you work, or you can use noise cancelling headphones to eliminate background noise, which is actually was a good tip during the last year when we were in lockdown, because I'm in a house with 3 kids, so sometimes the house is quite noisy. So if I have a set of noise cancelling headphones, it feels like I'm working in a library. So, even though that's not the case, the place could be on fire behind me. Or other non-essential activities could be just where you work. I mean, look around. Is there something that's distracting, like a television, or in my case, it was games console or magazines? Or is there notifications popping up on screen that are kind of pulling you away from focusing on whatever you need to do? So yeah, I would ask yourself, when are you most effective, and how long can you focus for? And when you find yourself getting interrupted, that's inevitably going to happen, but ask yourself, what was the cause of the interruption, and is it something that you can manage the next time around so you're able to focus for a bit longer?
When I love what you just said about parenting, because that is huge, and a large portion of the listeners here are parents. And especially in the last year, oh my gosh, when you brought up distractions, I was thinking, yes, 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 yes. What is your advice for parents who are in creative fields? How do they do this? How do they manage their time? Give us some tips. We need them.
We do. We have 3 kids. So I have a 16-year-old son, I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I have a 3-year-old son as well. It's a quote I came across a few years ago, which I found was quite helpful. That art is not the support system, or so your family life is not the support system for your art. Art is the support system for life. So in other words, if you feel like your family are preventing you from doing creative work, it should be the other way around. Your creative work should be enabling you to spend more time with your family. Took me a while to figure out that, but that's why I wrote a memoir about my experiences becoming a dad unexpectedly when I was 24, because I wanted to take all those experiences as a dad and write a book that wasn't about productivity, or wasn't about business self-help, or wasn't about the craft of writing. It was something different to which I've written before. So I went through old journals and stories and turned them into chapters or essays for this book. And I've written it almost like if I was 24 and a 39-year-old guy who's losing his hair came along and set me down over a pint of beer and said, this is what you need to know about the next 15 years. This is what other people aren't telling you. This is what they would say. So to bring that home to your question, your family life is, in a way, it's material for your creative work. It can inform it, because you can use the stories of experiences with your family for your work, or the gaze of your kids for the interesting ways they see things, to bring kind of new sense of originality to your work. And to hold that back from your work it's kind of doing it a disservice. People want to hear about that, because I mean, you said there, Anna, people listening to this have kids, so people want to hear those stories. People want to hear how they're like you, and I find that that's also a more rewarding topic to write about as well, at least for me.
And so how do you balance that then? How do you balance getting your creative work done and the noise and the distractions? Or do you incorporate that, all of it, somehow?
Yeah, it can be certainly challenging. So on a purely day-to-day level, it's just figuring out what parts of the day are quietest, or when do you have least distractions. So for me, it'd be early mornings. Although I'm working on my business full-time this year, so I had more free time during the day to do that. I mean, a family life is busy. Maybe it's just a busy season or busy time of year, so you just have to manage your expectations about what's possible. Maybe that was a lesson that all of us learned during the lockdowns, that what we wanted to do this year doesn't tie up with what's possible, because of extenuating circumstances. And also, as your kids get older, or as your family life changes, you'll naturally find that you have more time as well. Like our son is 3, and we already have a lot more time now, because he doesn't quite need the same level of hands-on attention that a new baby would, as in you don't have to physically hold them all the time.
Yeah.
You can be sitting beside you. Whereas about our 16-year-old son, he doesn't want to be sitting beside us at all. So family life does change, and you will get that time back. And also, I would say most people, I mean, there are obviously exceptions, but most people have more time than they realize. every time I look at the screen report on my iPhone, I'm always horrified. It's a reminder that that I should never complain about not having free time. So that would be another thing. And that comes back to the non-essential activities. What can you remove from your week to make sure you get whatever's important to you done? That you spend your time writing or painting or working on your craft or music or whatever it is.
I love what you said about managing your expectations and earlier what you said about running, because those speak to a topic that my audience is also deeply, deeply interested in, which is stress management. What do you as a creative recommend and yourself do to manage stress?
Managing stress, yes, a good question. So certainly important to have a system for managing stress. For me, it's a long distance running. I find it's quite helpful because I spend a lot of the day, writing in a room like this one or sitting in front of a computer or doing stuff online. So it's good to do something that's outside or something that's physical. And often if I'm struggling with an article or a book chapter, and then I go out for a run or to a CrossFit gym nearby, when I come back to write, it's often a lot easier because I've gotten time away from the problem and time away from the desk. I would also say meditation for me has been extremely helpful. I'd say my 20s probably struggled on and off with depression, whereas meditation is helpful for working through those moments. And it's also helpful for creative work because if you find yourself blocked or frustrated that your ideas don't match up to what you're trying to say, meditation can teach you to sit with those moments of frustration for a little bit longer. So I realize running isn't for everybody or even CrossFit, but meditation is relatively easy to learn using apps like Headspace, Calm, or Waking Up. And the benefits for focus, for creativity, and for managing stress are all there. There's a lot of research behind it, which I think Headspace has on their website.
Talk to me a little bit about, if you're okay with this. You mentioned that you struggled with depression. I know a lot of people who struggle with depression and trying to get themselves to meditate, and it doesn't match up, even though we know it's good for us. Any recommendations or suggestions?
When I first tried to teach myself to meditate, I watched YouTube videos of these mystics sitting cross-legged, and I tried to copy their poses and force my knee into an uncomfortable position, and I ended up hurting my knee.
Oh no!
So I didn't get very far. I spent more time watching the YouTube video and trying to stretch my knee than actually doing meditating. But eventually, I took some of the introductory courses in Headspace, and a couple of years later, I actually did some meditation workshops in person. But it goes back to the bird by bird metaphor, which is you don't sit and try to meditate for 20 minutes on day one. Just meditate for 30 seconds or 60 seconds, or, well, 3 minutes, I guess. That's normally long enough to sit there, and you will notice that your thoughts are running away with you, even though you're trying to focus on the breath. But that's the whole point. It's not that you have a good or a bad meditation session. It's just you sitting there on the cushion, and if you're feeling depressed or feeling low or feeling excited because you want to go and do something, or feeling restless because this isn't for you, or you're feeling that you've got a sore knee because you tried to sit in an awkward position, well, maybe adjust your knee. But that's the whole point of the practice, is just to sit there with those moments of discomfort. And it's also a bit like weightlifting. It's not something that you get a benefit from on day one, but it compounds over time, and you'll find you can sit and meditate for longer, sit and write for longer, focus for longer. And I'm not saying it's a cure for depression. Some people try to market it as a cure for depression, which I find surprising. I think it's more something that can help you sit with depression rather than freaking out or getting stressed by it.
So instead of running away or numbing, you're sitting with it and moving through it. Is that?
Yeah. And so instead of going out and drinking a lot, which maybe I would have done in my 20s if it was feeling low, using meditation can help you feel low without necessarily needing to respond to it.
Would you say that long distance running in a way is a type of meditation?
I would, yes, it certainly is. So when you're out running by yourself, it's just you for the most part, unless you're running with other people who are long distance runners. But you're focusing on the breath. You're hopefully focusing on your form and the way your foot is hitting the ground. And, you're thinking of what's next or what's around the corner. But that's after a while, your mind will clear. And on a good day, just like when you're in a good writing session or when you're meditating, all sense of time will fade away, and you'll just be aware that you're moving, and that's it. Not saying it's always like that, but sometimes that does happen. Um, and also long distance running, when I say that to people, they're like, how do you do that? But it's not that you're going out and running at full sprint for an hour or 2 hours. You're running at a slow pace that's manageable. So it's more about movement and spending time in nature, which are meditative practices too.
So how do you make time? A lot of people have problems making time for themselves, for exercise, for meditation, for all of these things, in addition to their creative work. What would you say to those people?
It comes back to eliminating what's non-essential in your day, eliminating distractions, and figuring out what's important to you. Oddly enough, meditation can feel like something that you've got to cram into your day, but when you do find time in your day for it, and this is something I still have to remind myself of, it helps you step back and find more time or mental headspace for stressful activities. So like last night, I was had a problem with my website. So instead of meditating before I went to bed, I was working on a website trying to fix a technical issue till 11 o'clock. And I should have just meditated and gone to bed, because when I went to bed and I woke up the next morning, because I'd had a good night's sleep, I realized what the solution was to the technical problem. Probably would have got that if I had meditated or stepped back rather than trying to push forward. So what I'm getting at is I was using time inefficiently, when maybe it was more helpful to step back. And that's something that I try to remind myself to apply for other activities too, that I might be getting stressed over, like a project in work that's not going well, or first draft of a book that I'm struggling to finish on time, or something with one of the kids. Sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it can feel like you're enclosed, but if you can step back, you can suddenly find you feel more expansive, and that you actually have the time and attention and resources to deal with it after all.
That is 100% powerful. I know my husband and I were talking about this. You get so caught up in the doing that you stop actually being effective at the doing. And just the stopping allows you to be effective again, which is
the hard bit is stopping, though, isn't it? At
oh
least for
my
me.
gosh. So how do you stop? Do you simply just bully your own brain, or what do you use to remind you?
Well, I'm still trying to remind myself to do it. I mean, last night I didn't stop. I was working on something I shouldn't have been working on, but I do try and remind myself to meditate twice a day. At one point, I did have reminders on my phone, and sometimes I'll, map out the day in a calendar and put in the actual times during the day that I want to meditate. So I find that's quite helpful. Other times, if I've been working on something for quite a while, particularly if it's a task at a computer and I feel myself, getting tension on my shoulders, that's probably a physical reminder that I need to get up and go for a walk or take a break, because maybe I'm getting stressed about whatever that particular task is. I also mentioned like family life. So sometimes you have to stop because it's one of the kids needs you for something.
Baby's banging on the door.
Yeah, exactly. You're coming into the room. So, and then by the time you sit down at your desk the following day, you've completely forgotten about the problem, but your subconscious hasn't. And then, you probably have a solution to it. But it's hard though. I'm describing all of these things. I wish I did them all the time, but that's what I try to remind myself to do.
But that's why we have mentors, right? That's why we have other people and accountability buddies. Or do you have any of those things?
I have had some people that I've looked to for advice over the years. So when I started an online business, I joined a mentorship program. And the person running that particular program gave me advice about how to run the type of online business that I have, and how these types of online businesses make money and find customers, and just what way to run it in terms of what content to publish and so on. So that was quite helpful. So I was in that for a few years. When I was working for a corporate company, there was a couple of people who helped me with my career and gave me advice. When I was working as a journalist, I didn't really have any mentors, so maybe that's why I didn't get very far. so that's my own fault really, because I didn't spend time building relationships with people. I think when you're like, I'm 40 this year, so I think when you reach a certain age, you don't need mentors anymore. Maybe there are people that you look to for advice on a particular problem, or you want to ask a question about a strategy or an idea that you have. But people who work with mentors, I think, would tend to be in their 20s to early 30s. They're ready to start their career, or they want to take the reins over their career. They just need somebody to help them take that final step.
Interesting. So when you're working and you're finding yourself exhausted or frustrated, you have your own systems in place. You don't really see the need for accountability or mentors or any of that stuff. You're more or less
Well, no, I can't. No, don't get me wrong. Accountability is
Oh,
still
okay.
very, very useful. Well, like when I was in a corporate company, I learned a lot about how personal accountability and also accountability when you're part of a team. And that's something I would always recommend, whether you're hiring somebody for your business or whether you're working with a client. And that can involve hiring somebody and explaining what the expectations are for the role and giving them some numbers or metrics or KPIs that help them understand what success looks like. And then they can feel confident in their job, and then you can feel confident you've hired the right person, or maybe that you haven't and you need to change that. Or if it's a client, you can, it can involve checking in with them early and often and letting them know the status of their deliverables and how far you are along with that particular project. And then the client can feel reassured that they've invested in the right person, which in this case will be you. So accountability is huge. And like for a writer, for me, it could be something as simple as the daily word count. Or for somebody who runs a content publishing website, which is what my business is, it could be a set amount of articles published each month that get web traffic around particular topics. So it's more the idea of mentorship and how people who work with mentors, I would say, tend to be in their mid-20s to early 30s because they're at a unique point in terms of personal development, as in they're ready to take their career more seriously, but perhaps they're not quite where they are yet with their career, at least some people. At least that's been my experience. I think it's more unusual to find people with mentors who are slightly older. Perhaps I'm wrong.
Well, I'm not here to discuss whether you're right or wrong. I'm here to get your opinions and your ideas.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. So tell me, as a business owner and a creative, because I know people get hooked up in this area, is growing your business and bringing other people on board. Because how do you grow when you're in a creative space?
There's a misconception that many creative people have that business is somehow icky or disgusting or debasing for your creative work, which in some senses can be true if you're running the wrong type of business. But if you spend all day working on your craft alone in your room, at some point you have to figure out how you're going to release it out into the world and find readers or customers or fans or listeners. And to create something that's a finished product, you're going to need people to help you. So if you've written a book, you're going to need an editor. If you want to publish a book that you're proud of, if you've recorded a podcast, you're probably going to need a podcast editor at some point who can help you clean up the audio. And if you're running an online course, you're probably going to need somebody who can help you with customer support once you start getting lots of students. So what I would say is at some point you'll need to figure out who can help me with this and who can help me grow my business and take it to the next level so I can serve my audience in a better way.
And I know you specifically do that for writers. So can you fill us in a little bit about...
Sorry.
No, that's okay. What you do with people and what programs you offer. And I know you have a website, becomeawritertoday.com. You have some courses, but fill us in.
Sure. So yeah, for anybody who's watching, I have a website where I offer practical advice for writers. It's becomeawritertoday.com. I also have a podcast under the same name, which is in iTunes. And I interview best-selling authors like James Clear and Daniel Pink about their writing processes. And then I also have a series of courses for writers, such as writing a book and solving problems like writer's block. So you can find that on the website as well.
Nice. And do you help people self-publish?
I cover self-publishing in one of the courses, so it is something I talk about. But my main kind of specialism would be helping people with nonfiction, helping people write books, and helping people solve creative problems like writer's block. So I have a free book of writing prompts, which can help you with writer's block. I have a membership community for nonfiction authors who want to earn a living. And then I have a course specifically on writing a nonfiction book as well.
Nice. And can you tell us really quickly a little bit about your podcast, name, title, where to find it?
Sure, the podcast is called Become a Writer Today. You can go to my website, which is that URL, and you'll see podcast at the top, and that'll take you to all the links. Or alternatively, look for it on iTunes. And if you look for it and enjoy it, please leave a review, because more reviews, more listeners will help more people find the show.
That's amazing. And for anyone watching, I will be putting, depending on which medium you're watching this on, the links will either be up here or down here, but look for them and we'll make sure we have the podcast link will be there, the website link will be there, and you'll be able to find Bryan and connect. Do you do mentorship as the mentor for other people, or?
Not really, no. I'm more focused on writing and publishing, but I do have some one-to-one coaching services that I offer. But to be honest, my focus is more on the publishing side of the business at the moment.
That's amazing. Okay, so you know where to connect, up or down, I'm not sure which one. And before we sign off, Bryan, the ultimate question, you are standing in front of your younger self at a time when you really needed to make a shift. What do you say?
I would say start now and don't overthink it, because the answers will reveal themselves through your work rather than worrying about what's going to happen next.
Amazing. Bryan, thank you so much for your time today. This has been very, very, very useful and educational.
Thank you, Anna. It was great to be on.
Thank you.